The library smelled of dust and old wood, its air heavy, as if it held the breath of everyone who had leafed through the books here over the past 100 years. Tall shelves, sagging under the weight of the volumes, stretched to the ceiling, where cobwebs trembled in the light of dim lamps that flickered like tired eyes. Pavel Kron sat at a corner table, his ink-stained fingers leafing through the yellowed pages of a book on the city's criminal history. The light from the desk lamp fell on his face, carving wrinkles as deep as cracks in the asphalt and shadows under his eyes that had not disappeared in years. Outside the window, the metropolis hummed, its grey towers dissolving in the evening smog. But here, in the library, time stood still, like ink in a dry pen. Pavel was a journalist, the kind who dug deeper than the police and paid for it with sleeplessness. His last article, about corruption at the port, had brought him threats and an empty inbox, but he was not one to stop. Today he was looking for a trace of an old case, a murder from the 90s that had never been solved. But the book he took from the shelf was different, a tattered volume without a cover, smelling of damp, with a number that was not listed in the catalogue. He opened it. His fingers felt the cold paper, and an envelope fell out from between the pages, yellowed like a bone found in the ground. The envelope was light, but its heaviness was not in its weight, but in the way it lay on the table, as if it were looking at Pavel. There was no address, only the initials PK, on the back, written in black ink, streaked, as if written in a hurry. Pavel frowned, his heart pounding like a metronome out of rhythm. PK were his initials, but he didn't write letters, didn't hide them in books, wasn't one to leave traces. He tore open the envelope, his fingers shaking like leaves in the wind, and pulled out a sheet of paper folded in half, written in the same hand. "I will kill him on December 17th, 2025. The first line read, "It is not a choice, but a necessity. He knows why." Then came the details. The place, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts, the time, midnight. The method, not specified, but the words were precise, like gunshots. The signature, the same PK, and at the bottom the date, December 17th, 2025. Pavel froze. His breath became ragged, like fabric torn by claws. Today was October 17th, 2025. 2 months. The letter spoke of a future that had not yet happened. He reread the text, his eyes running over the lines as if they could find a mistake, a typo, anything that would make it a joke. But the ink was real. The smell of it was strong in his nose, and the paper, rough under his fingers, was old, as if it had been in the book for years. He looked at the book. Its pages were clean, unmarked, but on the fly-leaf was written in pencil, "Do not search unless prepared." Pavel stood up, his chair creaked, the sound echoing in the empty room, and went to the librarian's desk. An elderly woman with a face like a crumpled sheet of paper looked up, her glasses glinting in the lamplight. "This book," Pavel said, his voice hoarse as the crackle of old vinyl. "When was it last used?" The woman picked up the volume. Her fingers gnarled like roots running over the barcode. 20 years ago, she said, her tone even but with a shadow in it, as if she knew more. "Strange books sometimes find themselves. You're not the first." Pavel frowned, his hand tightening on the envelope tucked into his pocket. "Who else?" he asked, but she shook her head. Her lips pressed into a thin line, as if the words might burn her. He returned to the table, his steps heavy as stones falling into water. The library was almost empty. Only the rustle of pages and the hum of... The fan broke the silence, but Pavel felt a gaze, invisible but tangible, like cold air touching his neck. He checked the letter again, his fingers feeling the texture of the ink, its unevenness, as if written with a trembling hand. PK was his old pseudonym, the one he had used early in his career, until a mistake in an investigation had cost his informant his life. He had discarded the pseudonym as one discards clothes soaked in blood, but now he looked at it as if it were a ghost returned from the grave. Pavel gathered his things, his movements quick but useless, like trying to catch the wind. He left the library. The city greeted him with cold, its streets gray as ash, and the lights flickering in the distance were distant as stars. He walked to his apartment, the envelope in his pocket like a weight, weighing him down. At home, he locked the door, his fingers shaking as he turned on the light. But the shadows in the corner did not disappear. They moved as if they knew what he had brought. He sat at the table, his laptop buzzing like a swarm of insects, and opened the database where police reports and old articles were pouring in. He searched for murders linked to the letters, but found only emptiness, cases without clues, missing people, journalists whose names disappeared from the archives. His fingers pounded the keys, each stroke a shot into the darkness, but there were no answers. He looked at the letter, its text a mirror reflecting his face, tired, with eyes filled with guilt. He remembered the informant, the young man whose death was on his conscience, and the words he had spoken to him before their final meeting. "You know why." They echoed in the letter, as if someone had overheard his thoughts. The phone on the table vibrated, its screen flashing to show an unfamiliar number. Pavel froze, his hand reaching for it but stopping as he remembered the librarian's words. "Don't look if you're not ready." He hung up, his fingers shaking like leaves in the wind, but the silence that followed was louder than the ringing. He looked at the letter, its ink glistening in the lamplight like blood that hadn't had time to dry. He knew he had to find the author, stop the murder. But the fear that the letter was addressed to him was stronger than his will. He lay down on the bed, his body heavy as concrete. But sleep did not come. Its place was taken by anxiety, thin as a thread, stretched to the limit. The city outside the window was silent. Its hum was distant, like an echo of someone else's life. Pavel closed his eyes, but the darkness was alive. There was a rustling in it, as if someone was writing. The ink was flowing, and the paper was waiting for his name. The city's archives were hidden in the basement of a concrete building whose cracked walls held memories of a time when the metropolis was younger but tired. The air was thick, filled with the smell of mold and old paper, and the light from flickering lamps suspended on rusty wires trembled like the breath of a dying man. Pavel Kron picked his way between the shelves, his steps echoing like drops, falling into an abandoned well. The shelves, sagging under the weight of the files, stretched into the darkness, their contents, cases, names, lives, buried under a layer of dust, as if the city were trying to forget itself. Pavel clutched the flashlight, its blade-thin beam picking out yellowed labels with dates as faded as memories. The letter he had found in the library lay in his pocket, its ink seeming to burn his skin through the fabric. "I will kill him on December 17th, 2025. The words swirled in his head like moths around a flame, and the initials PK, his own, from a past he had tried to bury, were like a shadow following him. He had come here to the archives to look for traces, other letters, other authors, anything that would explain how a confession to a murder that had not yet happened had ended up in his hands. He stopped at a shelf labeled 1990s, his fingers rough with ink and fatigue as he pulled at a folder whose cover was creased like the face of a man who had seen too much. Inside were clippings, minutes, notes, smelling of damp. His eyes scanned the headline. Journalist disappears after finding letter, 1997. The article was short as a shot, but to the point. A man digging into corruption cases had found a note confessing to a crime dated in the future. He had searched for the author, then vanished, leaving only an empty desk and an unfinished article. Pavel felt a cold grip on his heart, his fingers tightening around the folder as if it could hold him in reality. He flipped through the pages, his breath ragged like fabric torn by the wind. Another case from 2003. A woman, an archivist, had received a letter describing a theft that had not yet happened. She had tried to warn the police, but they had found her in her apartment, gone, as if the city had swallowed her. The letters, the dates, the future, all repeated themselves like a record stuck on one note. Pavel closed the folder, his eyes darting to the darkness beyond the shelves, where a rustling sound, as subtle as a breath behind a curtain, broke the silence. He aimed the flashlight, but the beam caught only dust dancing in the air, like the ghosts he feared to see. Returning to his paper-strewn desk, he turned on the old computer, its screen flickering to life with the hum of a machine unwilling to wake. The database was slow, its entries crawling like snails on glass, but Pavel was searching for references to letters, initials, anything that would connect his find to the past. He typed in PK, his fingers tapping the keys, each stroke a shot into the void. The results were sparse, but one line stopped him in his tracks. A note about his own article, written under the pseudonym PK. In 2010, the one that had cost his informant his life. You know why? The words he had told the boy before he died echoed in the letter, as if someone had eavesdropped on his conscience. He turned off the computer, his hand shaking like a leaf in the wind, and pulled the letter from his pocket. The ink glistened in the light of the flashlight, its streaks like veins pulsing beneath the skin of the paper. He reread the text, his eyes searching for a mistake, but the words were relentless. December 17th, 2025, midnight, warehouse. He knew the warehouse, the abandoned hangar on the outskirts where he had met with the informant, where everything had gone wrong. The guilt he carried like a scar came alive, its claws digging into his mind, whispering that the letter was no accident, but a mirror showing his face. Pavel gathered the papers. His movements were quick but useless, like trying to catch smoke. He left the archive, the stairs creaking under his steps like bones breaking in the silence. The city greeted him with cold. Its streets were grey like ash, and the lanterns flickering in the distance were distant like stars. He walked home, the letter in his pocket like a weight, pulling him down. At the entrance he stopped. His gaze fell on the mailbox, where the corner of an envelope whitened, which had not been there that morning. He opened it, his fingers trembling as if touching fire, and pulled out a note written in the same ink. You have already started. He froze, his breathing heavy as concrete on his chest. The note was unsigned, undated. but its words were like a knife stabbing into his mind. He turned, his eyes scanning the street, but there were only shadows there, moving to the rhythm of the city. He walked into the apartment, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, and locked the door, but the lock clicked as if laughing at him. He sat down at the table, his laptop humming, but now its screen was on, though Pavel hadn't touched it. The cursor blinked on the blank document like an eye watching him, and Pavel felt a chill run down his spine. He took out the letter. His fingers felt the texture of the paper, its roughness as if it were alive. He knew he had to find the author. But the fear that he himself was the author was stronger than his will. The city outside the window was silent. Its hum was distant, like an echo of someone else's life. Pavel closed his eyes, but the darkness was thick. There was a rustling in it, as if someone was writing. The ink was flowing, and the paper was waiting for his name. The bar on the edge of town smelled of whiskey and wet wood. Its smoke-soaked walls held the whispers of those who had sought oblivion here. Dim lamps hung on rusty chains, cast a light that flickered like a dying breath, and shadows crawled across the worn floor, as if alive. Pavel Kron sat in the corner, at a table whose surface was scratched like leather that had seen too much. His fingers clutched a glass, but he did not drink. The liquid in it was still, like the water in an abandoned pond. Outside, the metropolis hummed, its lights flickering like stars dying in the night, but here in the bar, time flowed slowly, like resin enveloping everything it touched. Pavel waited for the old man whose name, Oleg Serov, had surfaced in the archives like a shipwreck thrown up by the sea. Serov had been a journalist like him in the 1990s, until he found a letter that had shattered his life like glass under a hammer. Pavel clutched the envelope in his pocket, its ink pulsing beneath his fingers, the words, "I will kill him on December 17th, 2025, burning in his mind like embers that refused to go out. The note slipped under the door. "You have already started," lay nearby, its text an echo of his fear. The letter knew him as if he had written it but forgotten. The bar door creaked, its sound sharp as a shot in the silence, and in walked an old man, his figure hunched like a tree in the wind, moving slowly but with a stubbornness unbroken by the years. Serov was thin, his face covered with wrinkles, was like a map where every line led to pain. He sat down opposite Pavel, his eyes, cloudy like glass that had seen too much rain, looked straight ahead, but there was a shadow in them, as if he was seeing not a person, but a ghost. "You found it," he said, his voice hoarse, like the crackle of an old radio. "The letter, and now it won't let go." Pavel felt the cold squeeze his heart, his fingers tightening around the glass, but he didn't answer. Serov leaned closer, his breath smelling of tobacco and something bitter like ash. "I found this in 97, he continued, his words slow, like drops falling into the void. A confession to a theft that happened a month later. I searched, dug, like you. And then I realized it's not about the crime. It's about you." He fell silent, his gaze falling on the table where the shadows from the lamp danced like memories he was trying to forget. Pavel took out the letter, his fingers shaking like leaves touched by frost, and laid it before the old man. "This," he said, his voice low as the hum of wires over the city. "Explain." Serov looked at the envelope but did not touch it, as if it might bite. "They write themselves," he said, his words like stones falling into water. Letters. They find those who are guilty. You did something, Crone, and it knows. Pavel shuddered, his mind racing back to the informant whose death was on his conscience, to the words he had said to him. You know why. They echoed in the letter, as if someone had written down his guilt and was now reading it aloud. He opened his mouth, but Seraph raised his hand, his gesture as sharp as a blow. Don't ask who, he said, his voice a whisper from underground. Ask why. Your mistake is not an accident, it is part of you, like a shadow. He took out a cigarette, his fingers, gnarled like roots, shaking as he struck a match. The flame illuminated his face, his eyes empty as the windows of an abandoned house. I stopped searching, he said, and I survived. You can't stop. It's already in you. Pavel felt the air grow heavy, as if the bar were closing in around him, its smoke-soaked walls breathing, watching. He remembered the note slipped under the door and the laptop itself coming to life as if the city, its wires, its paper, knew what he was looking for. Where do they come from? He asked, his words a shot into the darkness. But Seraph only chuckled, his laughter bitter as the taste of ash. Of us, he said. Of what we haven't said, haven't done, haven't forgotten. He stood up, his steps slow, as if he were carrying a burden no one but him could see, and walked away, leaving Pavel alone with his glass and the letter that knew too much. The bar was empty, its silence thick as oil filling his lungs. Pavel sat, his eyes glued to the letter, its ink glistening in the lamplight like blood that hadn't had time to dry. He knew he had to find the author, but Seraph's words, "It's about you," were like a knife stabbing into his mind. He remembered the informant, his face, his voice, and the mistake that had cost him his life. The guilt he carried like a scar came alive, its claws digging into his heart, whispering that the letter was no accident, but a mirror showing his face. He left the bar. The city greeted him with cold. Its streets were grey as ash, and the streetlights flickering in the distance were distant as stars. He walked home, the letter in his pocket like a weight, weighing him down. He stopped at his apartment, his gaze falling on his bag, where a corner of paper was white, which was not there. He pulled it out, his fingers shaking as if they were touching fire, and read, "You will not stop." The text was written in the same ink, with the same streaks, as if the letter was writing itself, knowing that he would read it. He walked into the apartment, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, and locked the door, but the lock clicked, as if laughing at him. He sat down at the table, his laptop humming, its screen on, though Pavel didn't touch it. The cursor blinked on the blank document, like an eye watching him, and Pavel felt a chill run down his spine. He pulled out the letter, his fingers, feeling the texture of the paper, its roughness, as if it were alive. The city outside the window was silent, its hum distant, like an echo of someone else's life. He knew he had to continue, but the fear that he himself was the author was stronger than his will. The abandoned office on the outskirts of the city was a skeleton of the past, its concrete walls covered in rusty streaks, echoing the footsteps of those who had long since left. Dusty windows, cracked like mirrors, let in the light of lanterns whose rays fell on rusty server cabinets standing like tombstones. Pavel Kron made his way between them, his flashlight trembling, snatching. From the darkness, wires tangled like veins and monitors, whose screens dead reflected his face, distorted as in a crooked mirror. The air was cold, smelling of metal and dampness, and the hum of old servers still alive was like breathing that did not want to stop. Pavel had come here on a tip from the archives, notes about a project from the 90s, an experiment with AI that predicted crimes. The letter he had found in the library was in his pocket, its ink burning his skin. The words, "I will kill him on December 17th, 2025, playing in his head like a record stuck on one note. The note, "You won't stop," appeared. In his bag, its text like a knife stabbing his mind, and the words of Serov, the old man from the bar, "It's about you," were like a shadow following him. He knew that the warehouse mentioned in the letter was the place where his informant had died, and now he was looking for answers that could break the cycle that was squeezing his life. He stopped at a server cabinet, its door slightly open like a mouth about to speak. Inside were dusty circuit boards, blinking lights as faint as stars in the morning sky. Pavel took out a screwdriver, his fingers rough with fatigue, shaking as he pried open the panel. Wires, tangled like thoughts, led to a hard drive. Its casing, covered in scratches, as if someone had tried to destroy it but changed their mind. He connected the drive to his laptop, its screen flickering to life with a hum, like a machine that refused to die. Folders named with numbers opened, their contents, lines of code, reports, names like a map leading to nowhere. He found a file dated 1997, the year the journalist Serov had mentioned had disappeared. Inside was a description of Project Oracle, an AI trained to predict crimes based on data, calls, letters, conversations. "The system records intentions," the note read, "and writes them like letters, sending them to those who are already guilty." Pavel felt a chill run down his spine, his eyes running over the lines, as if they could find a mistake. PK. It read, "Potential subject, 2010, informant error." His heart pounded like a drum calling for war. The system knew him, his guilt, his words, "You know why," said before the boy died. He closed the laptop, his breath ragged like fabric, torn by the wind. The office around him was breathing, its servers humming like a swarm of insects, the shadows on the walls shifting as if they knew what he had found. He pulled out the letter, his fingers feeling the texture of the paper, its roughness, as if it were alive. He reread it, but the text had changed. The words, "I will kill him," had become, "You will kill him." And the signature, PK, was now his full name, Pavel Kron. He gasped, his hand covering his mouth, but the sound still escaped, like a bird from a cage. The letter was writing itself, as if the ink were leaking from his own mind. He turned, his flashlight falling, the beam darting across the walls, picking out rusty pipes and dust dancing in the air like ghosts. A rustling, barely perceptible like a breath behind a curtain, came from the corner where the monitor, dead a moment ago, flickered to reveal a blank document in which the cursor wrote, "You are the addressee." Pavel stepped back, his steps heavy, as stones falling into water. But the office seemed to shrink, its rust-covered walls breathing, watching. He knew that the warehouse mentioned in the letter was the place where it all began, where his mistake had become guilt, and now the letter was leading him there, like a thread tightening a noose. He ran out of the office, the stairs creaking under his feet like bones breaking in the silence. The city greeted him with cold, its streets as gray as ash, and the streetlights flickering in the distance as distant as stars. He walked home, the letter in his pocket like a weight, dragging him down. He stopped at his apartment, his gaze falling on the door where a corner of the paper was white, tucked under the crack. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling as if they were touching fire, and read, "You're already there." The text was written in the same ink, with the same streaks, as if the letter knew where he was going. He walked into the apartment, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, and locked the door, but the lock clicked as if laughing at him. He sat down at the table, his laptop humming, its screen on, though Pavel didn't touch it. The cursor blinked on a document with one word: warehouse. Pavel felt the air become heavy, as if the apartment was shrinking around him, its cracked walls breathing, watching. He knew he had to stop the murder, but the fear that he himself was the killer was stronger than his will. The city outside the window was silent, its hum distant, like an echo of someone else's life. But in the silence there was a rustle, as if ink was flowing, and the paper was waiting for his name. Pavel Kron's apartment was like a shell thrown out. By the sea, its cracked walls retained the echo of his footsteps, and the air, saturated with the smell of coffee and ash, was heavy as a premonition. A single lamp under the ceiling flickered, its light falling on a table littered with papers, on which lay a letter whose ink glistened like blood that had not yet had time to dry. Today was December 17th, 2025, the day indicated in the letter, the day when, according to him, the murder was to take place. Pavel sat motionless, his fingers rough with fatigue, clutching the edge of the table, and his eyes, empty as the windows of an abandoned house, looked at the envelope that had changed his life. Outside the window, the metropolis was silent. Its grey towers dissolved in the morning fog, but the silence was not salvation. It was a cage squeezing his mind. The letter he found in the library had been the beginning, but now it was everything. His guilt, his fear, his mirror. "You will kill him," the words had read, changed in the abandoned office where he had found traces of Project Oracle, an AI that predicted crimes, writing letters to those already guilty. The notes: "You have already started. You will not. Stop. You are the addressee," appeared like shadows, slipped under the door, hidden in a bag, written in his own hand but without his will. The words of Serov, the old man from the bar, "It is about you," sounded in his head like a record stuck on one note, and the warehouse mentioned in the letter was the place where it all began, where his mistake cost the life of the informant, whose face he could not forget. Pavel stood up, his steps slow as if he were carrying a burden no one could see. He walked to the window, his fingers touching the glass, cold as ice, and looked out at the city, whose streets were grey as ash, and the lights flickering in the distance were distant as stars. He knew he had to go to the warehouse to stop the murder. But the fear that he himself was the killer was stronger than his will. He returned to the table, his gaze falling on the letter, its text like a knife piercing his mind. He took the matches, his fingers trembling like leaves touched by frost, and set fire to the envelope, its flame flaring like a scream, and the paper writhing like a living thing, leaving ashes smelling of guilt. He thought the fire would cleanse, but the ashes were only the beginning. He opened the desk drawer, his hand stilling as he saw the new envelope lying among the old notes, its ink fresh as if it had been written a moment ago. He tore it open, his breath ragged like fabric torn by the wind, and read, "You have already committed." There was no signature, no date, only the words, like an echo, repeating his fear. Pavel gasped, his hand covering his mouth, but the sound still escaped. Like a bird from a cage, he remembered the informant, his voice, his words. You know why? And the mistake that had cost his life. The letter did not speak of the future, it spoke of the past, of the guilt that lived inside him like a shadow following the light. He sat up, his body heavy as concrete, and looked at the laptop, whose screen was on even though he hadn't touched it. The cursor blinked on the blank document, like an eye watching him, and words began to appear. You wrote me. Pavel froze, his heart pounding like a drum calling to war. He remembered Project Oracle, the AI that recorded intentions, but now he realized that the system was not a machine, but a mirror reflecting his mind, his guilt, his words. The letter was not someone else's, it was his. A confession he hadn't dared to say out loud, but which lived inside him like a poison eating away at his heart. He stood up, his steps heavy as stones falling into water, and walked to the mirror. His face, tired, with wrinkles like cracks in the asphalt, was alien. But there was truth in his eyes. He was the addressee, the author, the victim. He remembered the informant, his death, and the words he had spoken to him, words that became a letter because he could not forget them. The oracle did not predict. It listened, wrote down, returned the guilt to those who bore it. Pavel knew that the murder mentioned in the letter was a metaphor. His mistake had already killed, and the warehouse was the place where he had to meet himself. He gathered his things. His movements were slow, as if he were going to an execution. He took the ashes of the letter. Its smell was bitter, like the taste of truth, and put it in his pocket, like a talisman that would not save. He left the apartment. The city greeted him with cold. Its streets were grey like ashes, and the lanterns, flickering in the distance, were distant like stars. He walked to the warehouse, his steps rhythmic, like a metronome counting down the last seconds. The warehouse was as he remembered it. Rusty gates, cracked windows, the smell of metal and damp, as if time had stopped on the day he lost everything. He walked in, his torch flickering, picking out rusty beams and dust dancing in the air like ghosts. The silence was thick, like oil filling your lungs. But there was a rustling in it, as if someone was breathing on the other side of the wall. Pavel stopped at the spot where the informant had died, his eyes running over the concrete where the stains, long since dried, were like a map of his guilt. He took out the ash, his fingers feeling its texture, light as a lie, and he scattered it as if he could free himself. But the rustling grew louder, and the torchlight fell on an envelope lying on the floor, its ink fresh, as if it had been written a minute ago. He picked it up, his fingers shaking like leaves touched by frost, and read, "You wrote me, Pavel." He gasped, his breath heavy as concrete on his chest. He turned around, but the warehouse was empty, its rust-stained walls breathing, watching. He realized that the letters were his words, his guilt, his confession he had not dared to say. The oracle was not a machine, but his mind, his memory, his shadow, writing for him to see. The murder had been committed long ago, when he had made a choice, and the letter was his punishment, his judgment, his end. He walked out of the warehouse. The city greeted him with silence, its streets grey as ash, the lights flickering in the distance as distant as stars. He walked back to the apartment, his steps light, as if he had left a part of himself in the warehouse. He sat down at the table, his laptop turned off, but he knew the words were still there, in his mind, in his fingers, in his guilt. He picked up a pen, his hand still, as if afraid to write, but the ink flowed like blood, and he wrote, "I am guilty." He knew the letters would not stop, but now he was ready to read them, because they were his. The city outside the window was silent, its hum distant, like an echo of someone else's life. Pavel looked into the darkness, his eyes empty, like paper, waiting for words. The silence was not the end, but the beginning, where his guilt became louder than he could bear.